Okay, so today, first of all, I want to say thanks for the invitation to speak here again. It's been 3 years since I spoke at AUB, and I always enjoy coming and visiting. But what I want to do today is to propose an alternative critical understanding of Western bilateral and multilateral peacebuilding activities in the OPT. And what I'm going to talk about today is largely based on the article that Kareem just talked about, Peacebuilding as Counterinsurgency. Now, in this article, I argue that we need a new conceptual framework, a paradigm shift for how we understand peacebuilding, and argue that we need to take a much more critical approach. Now, just to give you a little bit of background about how I came to this position, my first postdoc fellowship was looking at conflict and development, and I worked for on a number of UN consultancies and consultancies for development agencies. And what I found, I was really horrified by the way in which peacebuilding has been implemented in conflict zones. And this helped me to form quite an extensive understanding of peacebuilding activities, and I became increasingly critical of them. Now, conceptually, I came to the conclusion that peacebuilding should be understood as another form of intervention. Now, intervention is a constant and central strategy in the international system. It takes the form of direct military intervention and imposed structures of political control through either donor aid development or governance policies, often in alliance with local elites. Now, these strategies are designed to implement a particular type of peace, which is based on the stability and security needs of Western states. This is to ensure the West's privileged position and that of its allies, as well as the institution of Western capitalist social forms. And in the other article that Kareem mentioned about peacebuilding as colonial practice, I'll go into that in a little bit more depth. So my main argument is that intervention, we need to understand it as both a method of imperial control and a method of transforming societies. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the concept and practice of peacebuilding. This is because it sounds incredibly benign and quite progressive. I mean, who can argue with the idea of building peace? However, the way in which it's developed by the UN and Western governments has given it a particular meaning and application that the original scholars such as Johan Galtung could not have envisaged or even supported. Now, I'll not go into in detail where peacebuilding is a international policy discourse emerged. You can read about that in some of my work. And actually there's a chapter in one of Kareem's forthcoming books where I do that. But the actual matrices, the peacebuilding matrices that were developed by Western governments and the UN afterwards, were all about planting the seeds of a particular model of Western capitalist economics and governance, underpinned by a very Western liberal assumption about what would create the conditions for a more peaceful society. Now, of course, there are differences between the Western agencies involved in the peacebuilding industry, or what others and myself call the peacebuilding industry, and there are hierarchies of power. So, for example, compared to UNDP, the international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank have considerable power to set the agenda for policy intervention in war-torn societies. For example, the World Bank has a seat on the UN Peacebuilding Commission. It sets up the trust funds for development. It drives the donor conferences and conditionalities, and it places state building at the top of the agenda. Now, the events of 9/11 also led to this obsession with Western donors of intervening in what they referred to as weak, fragile and failing states. So this also gave a huge emphasis on state building. Now, in the research that I've conducted, not just on Palestine but in other contexts, I've found that the most resilient parts of the Western peacebuilding matrix are those actually related to the pursuit of aggressive economic liberalisation policies and governance strategies which are focused on enhancing the instruments of state coercion and capacity building. And even we see democracy and human rights components are actually substantially downgraded when they interfere with these two main aspects. Now, the two co-edited books that I've done on comparative aspects of peace building, all of the case studies have shown this to be the case. And it's obviously, very obviously the case in the OPT also. So just to remind ourselves of what we're talking about when we come to the OPT, I think the visuals are very important because they show us things that words alone cannot describe. So this is the reality into which peace building has been implemented. The increasing reduction of land and space for a Palestinian state. Here we see 2009, and actually if we look even increasingly now, there's less and less space. So this is this actual picture on the far right. That's what the Western agencies are involved in terms of infrastructure building, etc. Now, the Western peacebuilding agencies have been operational in the OPT since the signing of the Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO in 1993. Now, there's over 50 donor countries involved and dozens of UN and other multilateral agencies involved in the type of peacebuilding and state-building practices that are implemented in other war-torn societies. And this is just another map to show you what we're actually talking about in terms of the Palestinian Authority-controlled areas in green. Obviously, we saw a split between the West Bank and Gaza since 2007 with different forms of administration. Here again, Area A, B and C. Area A is the only area in which development activities are carried out. And Area C, which is the largest part, is one of the areas which it's virtually impossible to get planning permission from the Israeli military authorities to carry out development activities. Now, all of these donor agencies and UN bodies created this aid management structure, and this is the most recent one. You can see it's a huge conglomeration of different agencies, working groups. And to be perfectly frank, I don't think they do a hell of a lot of good. I frequently interview the people that are involved in the Local Aid Coordination Secretariat, and a lot of these so-called policy units covering governance, economic, social development are pretty much moribund. They don't do an awful lot. Now, the UN, the World Bank, the EU and the US are the dominant Western agencies involved in peacebuilding activities in the OPT. I'm not going to go into how they operate just because for reasons of time, but ultimately the relationships and roles between them reflect the global structures of power as they manifest themselves in the region. So the US is dominant, the World Bank sets the agenda, the EU gives most of the money, and the UN carries out most of the activities. So these donors and multilateral agencies have invested a huge amount of resources to help to build Palestinian institutions, including the quasi-state structures of the PA. They've helped to pay for development projects and infrastructure building, as well as promoting civil society organisations. Now, it's really incredibly, notoriously difficult to get accurate figures for aid, but the IMF estimates that the Palestinian Authority alone, never mind any other aid, has received more than $15 billion in the 22 years since its creation. But let's remember that this figure is likely to be on the low side, particularly given that aid has not really been tracked consistently in the OPT since until the mid-2000s, when a mechanism was set up for that. So it's more likely to be much more than that. And obviously, the Arab donors are notoriously quiet on how much aid goes also. So here we see some of the aid. There's a disjuncture between pledges and disbursements, which is why the PA has recurrent shortfalls in its aid. But here we see the figures for donor aid, and you see that there's two peaks, which I think are very interesting and really tell us something about donor aid. So it steadily rises after the outbreak of the Second Intifada. You see 2002, it starts to steadily rise. And then there's a huge peak in 2008. This is when we see the split between the West Bank and Gaza, and the donors were really keen that the PA should not collapse, and they were really shoring up the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Now, what's really interesting now is that Palestine's not actually slipped down donor agendas despite the collapse of the peace process and the violence that we see at the moment. And recent interviews that I've conducted confirm this. Now, across the occupied West Bank, you can see billboards announcing a certain road or a school have been funded by a particular donor. And Palestinians are actually rarely allowed to forget this, and resentment occasionally surfaces. And this was a picture that I took on a demonstration in Ramallah in 2013. So despite this huge amount of money and resources, Western peacebuilding in the OPT has been frequently criticised. Critics argue that there seems to be a contradiction in promoting Palestinian institutions and governance structures and economic development in preparation for sovereignty in the context where Israel's continuing its practices of colonisation and repression. Now, critics such as Sarah Roy have also accused donors of failing to deliver peace. Now, I've written quite a lot of articles earlier on in my research on Palestine that accuse the donors of similar things. But actually, I'm no longer convinced that there is a contradiction. I actually argue in this article that Karim mentioned that if we reconceptualise peacebuilding as a form of counterinsurgency, then we actually see that peacebuilding has not failed. In fact, quite the contrary, it has largely succeeded. Because counterinsurgency, the goal is to secure a population. And there is a peace in the OPT, a very violent colonial peace as we see at the moment. But it is relatively stable, or at least it has been until the last month. Maybe now we're seeing the unravelling of the Oslo paradigm. However, it's remarkably strong in its continued adherence. What I'm not saying though is this form of peacebuilding as counterinsurgency is a good thing. In February this year, I had a very hilarious incident with a US Army officer who came to a talk that I did in New Orleans, who seemed to be seeing me as arguing for counterinsurgency operations in the OPT, and he said this is a really great idea. Now, I'm not arguing for that at all, so he completely got the wrong end of the stick. Instead, what I'm really arguing for is that if we relabel peacebuilding as a form of counterinsurgency in the OPT, we can actually develop a deeper sociological understanding of the policies and processes that, on first glance, appear contradictory when we look at them through a peacebuilding lens. Because there actually has been a lot of twists and turns in donor policy there that actually appear to somehow undermine each other, particularly in the different phases that the OPT has experienced in the past 20 years. I would go into them if we had more time, but I urge you to look at some of my written work. Now, money and effort is put into peacebuilding to stabilise an area, I argue, to secure a population. And I would argue that this is the core concern in the OPT, and this was confirmed to me in the recent round of interviews with the high-ranking Western donor officials and implementing agencies in Jerusalem and Ramallah. They all agreed that it was difficult to see anything positive was actually happening, even with all their support, and that what in actual fact we were witnessing is a form of stabilisation. So in this article I make three main claims. The first claim is that there is a deep structural symbiosis between the logic and methods of counterinsurgency and peacebuilding. Now, while the language is different, the strategies have a similar underlying rationale. Both promote forms of governance, development and security strategies to create acquiescence and control. Now, the OPT is no different from any other examples around the world, but its context gives it a very unique flavour, and my article tries to attempt to explain why that is. The second claim that I make is that what is normally referred to as the Israel-Palestine conflict is better understood as a vicious cycle of insurgency and counterinsurgency as Palestinians resist the colonisation of their land and suppression of their rights, and Israel seeks to expand its state of the whole of historic Palestine. If we think back to the map about the increasing building of Israeli settlements on the West Bank. And the third claim that I make is that Western peace-building strategies of state building, security coordination, and neoliberal economics that have been pursued since 1993 have been a form of counterinsurgency deployed against the Palestinians, although it's a very sophisticated form of counterinsurgency. Now, the main relationship of power, obviously, in this situation is between Israel, the coloniser, and the colonised Palestinians, and this relationship has not changed. And I'm sure that you've been reading writers such as Niamh Gordon and Sarah Roy, who've extensively analysed this from Foucauldian perspectives or political economy perspectives. But to this we must add a second relationship of power between the internationals, represented by the peace-building and donor agencies, and the locals, that is the Palestinians. Now, in the context of the OPT, these peace-building practices and aid dependency have created a control regime that's not only masked the occupation that's argued by people like Niamh Gordon, but it actually operates as another layer of pacification techniques that complement and mesh with the structures of domination and repression created by Israel. So what do I mean by understanding peace-building as a form of counterinsurgency? Now, counterinsurgency has a long history as a method of stabilisation. The colonial powers used them in their attempt to control anti-colonial struggles and movements within their empires, and the US utilised them during the Cold War to control and defeat nationalist and left-wing movements that challenged its economic and strategic interests. The relationship between counterinsurgency and development practices is a long one, and it's something that I'm exploring in a book that I'm currently writing, which expands on the thesis in the journal article. So counterinsurgency doctrine is based on the idea that successfully securing a population and immunising it against unrest requires strategies in development, security and governance. Now, Western donor-led strategies also focus on these spheres, although they have the self-proclaimed goal of developing mechanisms to reduce violent conflict and build a sustainable peace. So, of course, they don't use the same kind of language that the counterinsurgency community use. They use labels such as human security, state building, security sector reform, good governance, rule of law, capacity building. Resilience is the new one that's driving me daft at the moment. But there is actually a fusion of the goals and strategies of these two different communities and policies. Now, there's a number of ways in which I trace this symbiosis between counterinsurgency and peacebuilding in the article that I won't go into here because of time constraints. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. But it's actually clear from the documents and the practices, if you look at the counterinsurgency manuals that have been created since the 60s, if you look at French policy in Algeria, if you look at the British in India and Malaya, you see that there is a common goal of both peacebuilding and counterinsurgency in development terms and in governance terms to actually secure populations, and those who try to resist either to be co-opted or marginalised or defeated outright. So when I go on to apply this to the OPT, I begin by emphasising that the Palestinian struggle for self-determination has been an absolutely crucial one and hugely significant in the history of insurgency and counterinsurgency. A very influential RAND Corporation study a few years ago on COIN actually even placed the Palestinian struggle in a central position. And academics such as Lali Khalili, who I'm sure you've also read on insurgency and counterinsurgency, she's also argued that Palestine plays a central node in the research on this. So Israel's history has also therefore been a history of the suppression of Palestinian self-determination and rights. Israel's pacification techniques are very well documented, and Lisa Hajar has done a lot to bring that to the fore. They cover direct military intervention, methods of population control, restrictions of movement and residency, checkpoints, barriers on the wall, extensive repression through mass incarceration, detention without trial, torture, house demolitions, targeted assassinations, and collective punishment, as well as the use of local proxies and collaborators. And I go into this in quite a lot of depth in the article, purely because it's very, very difficult to criticise Israel in Western academia, and I'm like a lawyer when I've become meticulous about documenting this. So these more military-focused counterinsurgency practices are the result of Israel's aims of creating and expanding its state and securing dominance over the land and resources of historic Palestine with the least amount of Palestinians on it. Remember the map. So this creates for Israel a structural imperative of control and displacement, although of course Israel uses the language of security, and that's the language that the donors also use. Now we know that the signing of the Oslo Accord in 1993 didn't change this relationship. Israel remains the sovereign power despite the accords and despite the creation of the PA. Many critics of Oslo have pointed this out, but my argument goes one step further. I argue that not only did the Oslo Accords allow Israel to outsource control over the Palestinian population to a more apparently legitimate native ruling group, but it also meant that Israel's counterinsurgency strategies were thereafter supplanted and supplemented by techniques and mechanisms introduced by international peacebuilding actors that appear very benign and well-meaning. In fact, some of these strategies were even just adopted and adapted from Israeli ideas. If we look at, for example, the World Bank's industrial zones idea and Senator John Kerry's economic peace plan, they all are similar to the forms of economic peace strategies that Israel itself has tried to implement for many years. So therefore my argument is that Western peacebuilders have managed to implement many of the more subtle methods of counterinsurgency that have so far eluded Israel. These are the ones that are designed to immunise a population against unrest through creating a very sophisticated form of self-policing. I then trace this symbiosis between counterinsurgency and peacebuilding in the OPT through these three areas of governance, development and security, largely because these follow the key tasks defined by counterinsurgency writers, and they're also regarded as the key principles and tasks of peacebuilders in the OPT. So in the areas of governance, just quickly to go over what my main arguments are. In the area of governance, Western strategies have constantly and consistently focused on supporting Palestinian elites who accept the vision of peace on offer. And what they've done is they've helped to embed the power of these elites in opposition to others who reject an alternative or project an alternative vision of peace. Now I've labelled this strategy as the Partners for Peace paradigm in another article I published a few years back, because what's interesting is that you see the overuse of this phrase and how it's applied in a very, very clever way to exclude, control and manipulate, but it seems very benign. Partners for Peace, how can anybody disagree with that? Now, using aid to prop up preferred peace partners is very, very common in peace processes. But in this particular context, the definition of who is the sympathetic elite is defined as those who Israel will negotiate with and who are also acceptable to the US. So it's Israel and the US who decide who's the preferred partner for peace on the Palestinian side, and this is a very crucial method of control. Now, in the area of economic development, Western strategies have focused on supporting the development of infrastructure, and anybody who's visited Ramallah recently will see that it's just become a haven for restaurants and bars and huge flats and realty estate deals, etc. And they're also been focused on promoting a Palestinian business elite with vested interests in the Oslo paradigm. Okay, so we can see that this is how capitalism and imperialism works in other contexts, is to create business elites that have vested interests and connections with Western capitalism. But because this is taking place in a regional economic system that is all designed to try and normalise relations between Israel and the Arab states, it's actually managed to intensify Palestinian economic dependency on Israel. And this has been charted by writers such as Adam Hinea from SOAS. His chapter on the OPT in his books, Lineages of Revolt, is excellent in this regard. So this is another really important form of control that it's actually quite invisible unless you look structurally and sociologically at what's happening. Now, while the Western peacebuilding industry has a preference for neoliberal economic and good governance policies, their adoption in the OPT has been very gradual and a bit patchy. And it's been the outcome, if you like, of struggles and changes within the Palestinian elite, assisted and facilitated by changes in Israel's policies, as well as pressure from Western donors, particularly the World Bank and the IMF. Now, monopolies are still in existence, and they're often controlled by those who are connected to the PA. And so there is a form of crony capitalism that still exists that was created under Arafat, although it is in a slightly different format. But the possibility of actually creating some form of productive capacity in the West Bank is very much circumscribed by the Oslo framework, by the strictures of the Oslo Peace Accord and the Paris Economic Protocol, and by the restrictions of Israel's occupation and colonisation practices. This means that what we see in the West Bank is very, very weak growth, high unemployment, particularly amongst the youth, which is what's firing the resistance at the moment. There's a huge pressure on wages. There's massive growth in private consumer debt, and there's a very, very weak and struggling private sector. So finally, if we look at the security realm, peacebuilding strategies have focused on the creation and enhancement of a Palestinian security force which are capable of ensuring stability as a necessity in the pursuit of state building. Now, this is probably the most controversial part of the state building and peace building agenda there. So, okay, it's pretty much a common pursuit of state building and peace building to suppress domestic opposition. This is actually part of state building. We see this in the work of Charles Tilley, for example, when he talks about the state suppressing domestic opposition. But in this context, it's also meant promoting and regulating security coordination between Israel and the PA under conditions of occupation and colonisation. And this is another incredibly important form of control. So what we see is that Israel has had some level of security. In fact, over the last 5 years, Israel has had the best security that it's ever had. But what it has not done is created a secure situation for Palestinians, because the PA forces cannot defend its people against attacks from the Israeli military or attacks from Israeli settlers. And in fact, this is one of the key criticisms of activists, that the PA has largely just become a security contractor for the occupation. It's hard not to come to that conclusion, really, because Israel and the US, they frequently make the point that the security coordination that's developed under Oslo is the most important component of the framework. And so a picture emerges of a political economy, particularly in the West Bank. Gaza is slightly different because of the course that it's taken since 2007. But in the West Bank, what we see is a political economy that's the outcome of the interactions of Israel, the donors, and different sections of the Palestinian elite under this framework of peace building as structured by the Oslo Accords. And this, I would argue, should be understood as peace building as counterinsurgency in the context of a colonisation process. In essence, the goal is to stabilise the region, which requires the dismantling of Palestinian resistance to Israel's colonisation practices. And I would argue that Western peacebuilding has become a key part of this colonisation and fragmentation process, while at the same time managing to portray itself as trying to reduce or at least manage the negative impacts of occupation. Now, given all this, common sense might tell us that it would be in the interests of those who seek stability in the region to actually make sure that Palestinian self-determination is successful in some way. But this would only really hold true if we believe that the global stability being sought is one based on equality and justice. And I think many of us in this room that would agree that global counterinsurgency strategies do not seek to achieve this. They basically just seek to achieve stability. What they actually want is to manage and suppress the instability that results from the manifestations of global inequality and repression. They want to control it, not resolve it. Because to actually try to resolve these contradictions would require a reconfiguration of global power to allow local populations to decide their own developmental and political futures. And that's a solution that global counterinsurgency actors cannot consider, because it basically challenges their power and privileges. So am I painting a very miserable picture of a negative and repressive peace? Well, yes, I am, unfortunately. There is a very stable and violent peace, but there's also this very glaring contradiction. While Israel and the West tried to enforce stability and acquiescence through these different mechanisms of control, there still is, in reality, an occupying power that is implementing policies of colonisation which are inherently destabilising. If you take land and resources from people, it will always provoke confrontation. And we can maybe see at the moment the unravelling of the Oslo peace process before our eyes. Domination and control is therefore not always easy to implement, nor is it always complete. At least I hope that it's not always complete or easy. Thank you.